Okay, Dr. Long, we're going to go ahead and start. So everybody, we're going to start the class. There's still some people coming in, but it's 10 minutes after starting time. So if there's anybody that's new for our presentations here, today at 10 o'clock and around 1 o'clock, you got an email, and the emails contained all the links for today's class. In there was a nursing evaluation and social worker evaluation form, and a category that says others. So if there's any ministers or anybody else that's in here and still wants a certificate, we have a certificate of completion for you all. So at the end of the class, the forms will be activated. And if you're a nurse or a social worker or someone else, go ahead and complete the evaluation form, and a certificate will be emailed to the address that you put on that form, the name and address that you put on that form. Okay. Also in those links is that you have a set of handouts and a copy of the disclosure form for tonight. So if anybody is new, the people who regularly attend the class know this already, but if you're new, just pay attention to that go back to the email tonight that you received at 10 and 1 o'clock with all the links, and the evaluation forms and the certificates are in there. After you fill out the evaluation form, within 10 minutes, the certificate will be emailed to your email address. Okay. One other thing too, is what we're going to do is that when we get started, I'm going to mute everyone. You will not be able to unmute yourself until halftime. We'll unmute everybody, and that way you can ask questions at halftime. And then after that, at the end, we'll do the same. We'll unmute everybody, and you can ask questions at the end. This way, nobody is disturbing the presentation. Dr. Long, could you go to the next slide, please? Okay. Yeah. So this is the disclosure form, and it says the Akula Foundation has no relevant financial, professional, or personal conflict of interest of any product, manufacturer, or service provider. This program is provided solely for the education of the healthcare community. The planners and presenters of this CE activity have disclosed no relevant financial relationship with any commercial companies pertaining to this activity. Okay, can you go to the next one, please? Okay. The successful completion of this activity, you must be present no later than 10 minutes after the presentation has started. Must be present for the entire given presentation and also registered. You must submit an evaluation form at the end of the activity. The system will close within 24 hours to make sure that, after 24 hours, you can't fill out your form anymore. The certificates will follow. Your evaluation information is your sign-in. Without that information, you did not attend the class, and no certificates will be issued. You have 24 hours to register any complaints that you may have after the class closes for the final reports, and no other further action can be taken after 24 hours. If there's any problems before, during, or after, this email address here, ceu@canonhospice.org, you can go ahead and email me during or after the presentation, and we'll try and solve any problems at that time. So let's see, before you start, let me go ahead. I'm going to mute everybody. And Dr. Long, after that, you're going to have to unmute yourself, okay?
Okay.
Okay. And then Okay, so everybody should be locked in now. We shouldn't have any disturbances. I'll keep monitoring just in case something breaks through though. So everyone, we're going to start the class. We're very, very lucky to have Dr. Long tonight to do his presentation. It's something we've been looking forward to for a very, very long time. So Dr. Long, it's you now.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. We're going to be talking about some of the groundbreaking new findings from literally the largest near-death experience study ever reported. Upgraded some findings for this very show tonight. So this is really at the leading edge of evidence of the afterlife that can be found in the science of near-death experience. And part of this is the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, nonprofit organization I set up over 20 years ago. And there's the URL right there. So we'll have time for questions at halftime and time for questions at the end. So please hold your questions or write them down, or remember them. Usually people have a lot to ask about this. Holy cow, remember that one, folks? Well, I used to live in Homa, and as we all know, Hurricane Ida hit late August of last year, and certainly caused a great deal of damage throughout Homa and a large number of other areas throughout southern Louisiana. And here's what happened to my house. That's the debris pile from stuff they took outside my house. So you could literally think, and that's not even all of it. I mean, they literally gutted the inside of the house. You could say my house had a near-death experience. And just, there you go. That's what's left of the inside of the house. The house is still not fully rebuilt. Thank goodness for homeowners insurance. So that is why I'm giving this talk from Kentucky. We moved up here to be close to grandchildren and left this house to be repaired down in Kentucky. But I spent 12 years in Homa. But let's talk about evidence of the afterlife, the science of near-death experience. I first wrote about this in a book that was published in 2010 with the title of the talk we're giving here today. Within less than a week, it became a New York Times best-selling book and immediately changed my life. I've been extensively on national media, NBC Today Show, The O'Reilly Factor, the Dr. Oz Show twice, CBS Inside Edition. I was even honored to be asked to present my findings at the New York Academy of Sciences. And I talked to about pretty much every group that was in Homa, churches, certainly hospices, Rotary. So you name it, I pretty much talked to it. So it's been, since I published this and started doing this type of research and revving it up, it's certainly become very life-changing and enormously interesting. Over the 20 years I've been presenting this in the media, I've literally reached tens of millions of people with research regarding near-death experiences. So what are we doing as far as research methods? Well, I've been personally investigated over 4,000 near-death experiences, reviewed them, and they're posted on our website, nderf.org, which is by far the largest publicly accessible collection of near-death experiences in the world, and by far the largest data set of near-death experiences for research ever. As far as methods, we use the most validated research thing, a thing called the NDE scale, 7 or higher. All of these near-death experiences are. You don't have to worry about what that all means, but do know that in our research database and the NDEs that I'll be presenting, these are first-person accounts shared in English, and all of these people were, from their account, physically unconscious or clinically dead with an absent heartbeat at the time they had their near-death experience. For the cross-cultural study part of this investigation, the survey that we have posted on the website was translated into over 30 different languages. Huge thanks to my wife. While she's an attorney, she's devoted her full times to the near-death experience research on the website. So with the website and the survey translated with portions into over 30 different languages, is truly an international outreach. Many people share in their native non-English language. We have human translators, volunteers, translated into English, and we post both versions. The website has over 50,000 unique visitors every month. So as a result of that, especially for non-English or English translated ones, we have huge numbers of people that are able to take a look at that and let us know if the translations aren't perfect. We post all near-death experiences, or what we call probable near-death experiences. Typically, there's not quite enough shared to verify they were unconscious or clinically dead when they had their experience, but they're all posted if they give us permission, which is well over 95%. It's actually close to 100%. We have a very careful vetting process. If you're interested, we have that posted on the website. We're very, very cautious to make sure that the near-death experiences that we post and call as such are authentic. One interesting note, there was a major study last year, a major organization, a billionaire named Bigelow, set up the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. And Mr. Bigelow had an essay contest put out to the whole world. The essay contest was to be the best evidence of life after death. It was a 25,000 word essay, so that's like dang near a third to a half of a book. So these were huge essays that they were wanting. They had over 1,000 people share their essays. They had a panel of 6 judges that were very knowledgeable, review in detail over 200 of them. So this panel and this peer review, please understand, is among the most stringent scholarly peer review of this type of research possible. So when you see these rather remarkable research findings, please be aware that this has been vetted by some of the toughest, strictest peer review imaginable. And here we are. I submitted an essay of my research that I'll be talking about today. I was honored to be in the runner-up group, and certainly near-death experience was the most common topic in the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies contest, the most common theme that was evidence of life after death. And when I presented with my essay to the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, it was original research and has stood as what you're going to see today is among the strongest scientific evidence for an afterlife that has been presented. Well, let's start by having everyone on the same page. What exactly is a near-death experience? You're near death. In other words, you're so physically compromised that you're unconscious or clinically dead, absent heartbeat, absent breathing. So you're truly near death. So severely compromised that if you didn't get better, you'd be permanently, irreversibly dead. Now, at that time that you're that close to death, you have an experience, a lucid, organized experience, and that's the experience in the term near-death experience. Now, while no two near-death experiences are the same, all researchers that have looked at large numbers of them see a very consistent pattern of elements or characteristics. What happens during the near-death experience, typically described in very consistent order. So here are these NDE elements. There's that life-threatening event, that close brush with death. One of the common first elements is called an out-of-body experience. Consciousness separates from the physical body, typically rises above the body, and from that vantage point, they can see ongoing earthly events. About 45% of people report that have near-death experiences. And then they often, as they go through their near-death experience, a great majority have heightened senses. They have intense and generally positive emotion or feelings. I mean, isn't that amazing? They right at the moment you nearly die, and all of a sudden they're feeling better than they ever have in their life. They may then pass into or through a tunnel, which is variably described, but never claustrophobic. Often at the end of the tunnel, they encounter a mystical, beautiful, described as unearthly, often white light. In this unearthly realm beyond the tunnel, they may encounter mystical beings or deceased relatives. And these are joyous reunions with people that they knew in their earthly life. And that includes deceased pets, by the way. They're often in a beautiful, if you will, unearthly realm. There can be buildings, landscapes, colors described that are more beautiful than any color they've known on earth, music that they say is beyond anything possible in earth and its majesty. So truly a remarkable realm they're in. Near-death experiencers almost always report an alteration of time or space, typically saying time is either radically different from the earthly time that they knew, or time doesn't exist at all. They may have what's called a life review, their encounter part or even all of their prior life. As we said, they can encounter those unworldly, often called heavenly realms. They may believe that this time they've encountered special knowledge or understanding or wisdom, and we will get into that. Often at the end of the near-death experience, there's what's called a barrier. That means it can be like a fence and could be a bridge over the trail that they're on, a chasm, variably described. There's often other beings with them, but amazingly, when near-death experiencers encounter that barrier at the end of their experience, the great majority don't want to return to their earthly life. If they have a choice to stay in that unearthly or heavenly realm or return to their physically body and go on with their earthly life, great majority will often argue strongly that they want to stay in that realm where they feel that overwhelming sense of peace, love, and often in these what we call unearthly realms, people having a near-death experience have a very strong sense it's their real home. So ultimately, when they return to their body, either sent involuntarily or ultimately when they make a choice and they recover from what nearly killed them, they have their near-death experience to share. So I've been doing over 20 years of research with this. Again, this is the nderf.org website. And again, over 4,000 near-death experiences researched and posted on this website, free to anyone in the world. As you go through this, I want you to keep in mind a basic scientific principle, and that is what is real is consistently observed. That, guys, it's all scientific research everywhere. So what you're going to be hearing today is quite remarkable, but please be aware, not only in my research, but corroborated by many other near-death experience investigators, indeed, what you're going to be hearing is indeed very consistently observed. Again, a huge shout out, special thanks to my wife, Jody. I couldn't do this otherwise. It's literally her full-time job to manage the website and help with the research. It's really a two-person job, and thanks to Jody. So who has near-death experiences anyway? Well, in 1981, a Gallup poll was done and published, which estimated perhaps 5% of adults in the United States have experienced a near-death experience. So they're not rare. Undoubtedly, in the United States, been over 1 million people that have had it. Other studies from other areas of the world are coming up with a similar estimate of how many people have experienced near-death experiences. And I may slip and use the abbreviation NDE or NDEs for near-death experience. Well, the bottom line is, when you have a life-threatening event, you can't predict who will have a near-death experience or who won't, nor can you predict what the content of the near-death experience will be. I co-authored a scholarly book chapter looking at over 20 years of NDE research, and that was our group conclusion. So near-death experiences, who has them? Well, anybody, children and adults, physicians, scientists, clergy, religious, and atheists, and even people who never heard of near-death experiences and think nothing like that could possibly happen to them. All of these people report near-death experiences. Now, interestingly, NDEs happen only about 10 to 20% of those who nearly die. 80 to 90% don't have an NDE, and we're not absolutely sure at this point why some people have NDEs and why some don't. But the bottom line is, NDE, an equal opportunity experience, anybody can have a near-death experience. Now, the initial book that I published over a decade ago, The Evidence of the Afterlife, came from our study. NDERF stands for the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, our research website. And I wasn't alone in doing this research. Even when I started this, there are literally, and especially more so today, there's literally hundreds of prior scholarly articles about NDE in some of the leading medical and scientific journals. So this really is literally mainstream. And as I mentioned, what you're going to be hearing today, the major study findings I presented have been corroborated with prior scholarly research, often smaller studies, but typically we're all seeing the same thing. Uh-oh, what have we here? Okay, skeptics may wonder how we do near-death experience research. There's the light at the end of the tunnel. So I want to assure everybody, we don't do NDE research this way, but I think that's interesting. So moving quickly on, let's see how we do the research. We do it pretty much as we've talked about, and here's our findings that we have. I'm going to go through 12 lines of evidence that all converge on the concept that near-death experiences are, in a word, real. And the very first level of evidence for the reality of near-death experience and its consistent message of an afterlife is crystal clear consciousness. Now, to understand how amazing it is to have clear consciousness during a near-death experience when you're physically unconscious or clinically dead, cardiac arrest, or a heart attack, if you will, is when your heart stops beating. Immediately when your heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after blood stops flowing to the brain, the EEG or electroencephalogram goes absolutely flat. There's no measurable brain electrical activity. So it should be impossible under such circumstances to have a lucid organized memory at that time. And yet, by the hundreds, near-death experiencers report that. In fact, in my recent study of 834 near-death experiencers, and you'll keep seeing that 834 number, that's my most recent crunching of the numbers from the data I have, the most recent version of our near-death experience survey, I asked them, near-death experiencers, very directly, how did your highest level of consciousness and alertness during the experience compare to your normal everyday consciousness and alertness? Amazingly, even though they're unconscious or dead seemingly at the time, well over 3/4 said that they were having more consciousness and alertness during their near-death experience. 17% said, well, it's normal consciousness and alertness, and a little under 5% actually felt they were less conscious and alert during their experience than their earthly everyday life. Indeed, near-death experiences not only typically have a higher level of consciousness than normal, but they're also remembered essentially verbatim years to decades later. And that's been observed in both prospective and retrospective studies. Near-death experiences seem to be a very special type of memory that is very different from typical earthly memory. Well, second line of evidence is, you might recall, a common first element, or what happens in a near-death experience, is that out-of-body experience, consciousness going above the body and observing earthly events. About 45% of people describe seeing ongoing earthly events during their NDE, but an excellent research question is, okay, is what they're seeing real? And again, even though their physically body is on the verge of is dying, what they see has been studied by a number of researchers. We had a prospective study, 2 different researchers, Doctors Sebom and Sartori. They again found very convincing evidence that what people were seeing was absolutely real, down to the finest details, which is absolutely amazing. Dr. Holden reviewed all published scholarly near-death experience literature and found that of 92% of these out-of-body experiences reported, they were without any inaccuracy whatsoever. If there was even the tiniest observation wrong in that out-of-body experience, Dr. Holden put it in the not real category. And even with such stringent criteria, 92% of these out-of-body experiences, what they were seeing of earthly events, accurate down to the finest details. I studied 287 near-death experiences, and nearly 98% of these observations seemed absolutely real without any possible inaccuracy. Again, very fine details: who was coming in the room, who resuscitated them, what they said, how they did it, struggles they were having, family members' reaction. I mean, you name it, all these details down to the finest detail, accurate with no error whatsoever. And in fact, remarkably, these out-of-body observations aren't necessarily just over their physical body, typically on the ground or laying down dying. These out-of-body observations can be geographically far from the physical body. I mean, even blocks, even miles away have been reported, many cases of that. And again, even though these out-of-body experiences they're observing earthly events far from their physical body, far beyond any sensory possible awareness, what they see and what they hear, again, is accurate down to the finest details. And that obviously is absolutely medically inexplicable, to have a near uniform, accurate out-of-body observations. Well, here's a line of evidence number 3 about the reality of NDEs, and that's visual near-death experiences in the blind. Now, blindness can vary. You can be born blind, you can be partly blind, you can develop blindness later in life. However, we have a report from a person born totally blind who had stunningly visual vision during their near-death experience. First time they'd ever experienced it, having been born totally blind. So near-death experiences in the blind, including totally blind, legally blind from birth, have indeed been reported. And these are typical near-death experiences with the typical elements, but they have that vision. Well, let's give an example of that from Marta. This was a near-death experience she shared. Marta was 5 years old and blind when her mother wasn't keeping an eye on her, and she went out into a lake. So in Marta's own words, I breathed in the lake water and promptly lost consciousness. I was pulled out by a beautiful woman who was dressed in bright white light. She looked into my eyes and asked me what I wanted. I was completely satisfied and at first could think of nothing. Finally, it occurred to me I wanted to take a trip around the lake. In my journey, I saw detail I would never have been able to see in real life. By simply intending, I could go anywhere, even to the tops of trees. I was legally blind. For the first time, I could see leaves on trees, birds' feathers, birds' eyes, details on telephone poles, and in people's backyards that was far more clear than 20/20 vision. Mundane details, telephone poles, birds' feathers, bird's eyes, maybe not exciting to us, but for Marta, seeing it for the very first time in her near-death experience, very dramatic and very memorable. So a little bit about near-death experience skeptics. I mean, already you can see some of the very powerful lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experiences. So what do the skeptics say? Are there any good alternative explanations? Well, near-death experience skeptics over the years have proposed over 20 different explanations of near-death experience. I've heard it all, you name it, varied. Physiological, psychological, cultural, so-called explanations. Well, why are there over 20? Well, the answer to that is very simple, and that is the skeptics collectively themselves as a group can't agree on any one or several of these skeptical explanations of near-death experience that make sense to the group of skeptics as adequately explaining near-death experiences. There's simply no skeptic explanation that holds water, and skeptics as a group can't come to any idea what the deal really is. Just a little bit about skeptical arguments, because again, these lines of evidence are so strong. Well, are near-death experiences like dreams? One of the common questions I get. In the first version of the survey of near-death experiences I ever posted, I asked a question: was the experience dream-like in any way? And the answer I got was overwhelmingly no. Heck no, no way. I was embarrassed. The near-death experiencers were so adamant that their near-death experience was nothing like a dream. I dropped that after the first version of the survey, somewhat embarrassed, but I learned. We have a subsequent, more recent survey question that asks, following the experience, have you had any event in your life, medication, or substance which reproduced any part of the experience? The answer to that question, including the possibility of dreams, is essentially no, except for having another near-death experience, very, very uncommon, but that is the bottom line from the near-death experiencers themselves. There's really nothing like a near-death experience. And certainly I would submit those that had near-death experiences are obviously in the best position to determine if their NDEs were or were not like dreams. NDEers themselves, no way, nothing like dreams. So another skeptic, argument that came and went, frankly, are near-death experiences fragments of memory from the time, in other words, as you're entering into unconsciousness or exiting from unconsciousness at the time of a near-death experience, or you have little fragments of memory on both ends that may account for the NDE? Well, the answer is hell no, but here's the details. Fragments of memory could not possibly, well, they could explain unreal hallucinatory experiences, but not the grippingly real characteristics, what happens during NDEs that you'll hear all through today's discussion. The out-of-body observations and near-death experiences we just discussed are virtually never unreal or hallucinatory. In fact, these out-of-body observations, when they see ongoing earthly events during their NDE, this almost always corresponds exactly to the time that the person's unconscious or clinically dead. I mean, heck, when they're in that out-of-body experience and they're seeing their own body, they're often seeing people frantically trying to bring them back to life. So they're not going into unconsciousness or emerging from it. In fact, we have an NDERF survey question: at what time in your experience were you at your highest level of consciousness and alertness? Answer: during the near-death experience, not before or after. Certainly, fragments of memory doesn't explain near-death experiences in the blind. It can't explain near-death experiences that occur under general anesthesia we'll get into. So again, one of the leading skeptical arguments doesn't even come close to holding water. And as we go on with the evidence for the reality of near-death experience, that will become increasingly evident. So you can see just two examples right there how, boy, for lack of a kinder word, how ridiculous skeptic arguments are. By the way, these are a couple of the strongest skeptic arguments, not the weakest. So that's what we got. Well, getting back to near-death experiences during general anesthesia, under that blanket of sleep, consciousness should be impossible. If you've been through general anesthesia, you know what I'm talking about. You're awake, boom, you're asleep, there's nothing, and then you wake up. So it should be impossible. I studied 23 near-death experiences that clearly occurred under adequate general anesthesia. Don't forget, at the time of general anesthesia, they're very careful to monitor the heart and breathing. So when the heart stops and a near-death experience occurs, that's very well documented. So they're under anesthesia and their heart stops. Well, near-death experiences do occur under such circumstances, and they're typical near-death experiences. In my survey, There are 33 questions directly asking about the characteristics, the elements of the near-death experience. And in my study, 32 of the 33 elements occurred equally often among the group of people that had NDEs under general anesthesia compared to the group of near-death experiences that occurred under all other circumstances. The only difference was tunnel. Near-death experiences under general anesthesia statistically significantly had more tunnel experiences. I don't know why that is, but the key question I asked in the survey was the degree of consciousness and alertness, and amazingly, no statistical difference at all. So even under general anesthesia, did not affect in any way the level of a consciousness and alertness during their near-death experience, which again is absolutely astonishing and obviously absolutely medically inexplicable for heart to stop and under general anesthesia. A conscious experience under general anesthesia when your heart stops should be doubly medically impossible. I talked briefly about what's called the life review. Well, what happens during a life review? You may review a part or even all of your prior life. And yes, you heard me right. They may be unconscious for or clinically dead, typically for minutes, usually for way under an hour. And yet during that period of consciousness, they may review their entire life. That's an excellent example of the amazing acceleration of consciousness that occurs during a near-death experience, far beyond level of consciousness and alertness and processing information that you could ever do during your earthly life. Well, I did a study of 88 near-death experiences that described a life review. That was about 14% of all NDEs. So my research question was, okay, they've seen part or all of their prior life. Is there any reason to doubt the reality of what they saw in their life review that occurred in their prior life? Bottom line, result of that study, perfect playback. Even long forgotten memories were relived and remembered during the life review. And especially notable are the memories like in toddler time. You may see or hear a dramatic event while they're a toddler, and then they would then, when they recover from their near-death experience, ask their parents and verify, yes, wow, what you saw really happened, even though the near-death experiencer had long forgotten it. I have to say, fear not the life review. Why? Because the very first talk I gave about my near-death experience research in HOMA, I was talking about the life review. I was looking at the audience and people were looking kind of like, weird looks on their face. I was thinking, what the heck is all that? So in the question answer, people came up and said, gosh, Dr. Long, I've done some things in my life I'm not proud of. What if I have a bad life review? Well, that's why I said that ever since on my talks. Fear not the life review. Seriously, even though you're reviewing all or a part of your prior life, essentially never is there any external judgment by another being, and they're often around, of a life review that you're having in a near-death experience. If there's any judging about what you see in the life review, it's solely up to the near-death experiencer. Fear not the life review, it's okay. In fact, the life review can be a fantastic learning tool, seeing what you did in your life, learning what worked, what was loving, what wasn't, and it helps to encourage near-death experiencers to live a better future life. Family reunion. This is another line of evidence of near-death experiences, and that's reunion with deceased loved ones. These are really dramatic accounts that people talk about this. Loved ones that they may have recently lost or lost decades ago, and yet here they are, typically in these unearthly or heavenly realms. Bam, there they are. And even if that individual died of a very advanced age or disfiguring illness, they're essentially always in the near-death experience, their deceased loved one, picture perfect health. There's a lot of sharing, a lot of interaction. Again, even if earthly life was strained, typically very joyous when they meet in the near-death experience. So the study I had was, okay, wow, so you're encountering people in the near-death experience that died. Well, what about encountering living people? And the answer is both me and another study by Dr. Kelly found that if you encounter these beings in an unearthly realm, only 4% of the time are they alive at the time of the near-death experience. 96% of the time, they're deceased. And that's unlike any other experience of a dream or hallucination, where dreams, you're typically going to encounter living people. Even hallucinations, you're going to encounter a great majority of time people that you knew in your recent memory, but not so in near-death experiences. In fact, in near-death experiences, they may encounter relatives or siblings that they never met that died, and they didn't even know that they had died. We have a small series of people that encountered deceased siblings, brothers or sisters, that they never knew they had. These are typically childhood near-death experiences. Parents want to, if they've have a child that died, they're often so grief-stricken that they don't want to tell the brother or sister until they're old enough to better understand death. And so imagine the astonishment of parents when the child has a near-death experience, comes back and says, I met my sister, I never knew I had. And when they describe a brother or sister, invariably in my series, the gender is invariably correct. And the parents are astonished and say, yes, that's really what happened. Pets too, as a pet lover, I am thrilled at the huge number of near-death experiences where they encounter beloved pets. Again, joyous reunions, pet essentially always in picture-perfect health. There is a preponderance of relatives encountering deceased loved ones. And as I mentioned, that same only 4% of beings encountered that were alive at the time of the NDE, corroborated by another large Kelly study. So again, separating near-death experiences from all other types of altered consciousness in the overwhelming predisposition to encounter those who previously died. Now, here's an interesting one. I mentioned briefly about children that have near-death experiences. Well, near-death experiences absolutely can occur in children, and an excellent research study is to investigate very young children. So I did. I investigated 26 NDEs in children that were age 5 or younger. Average and median age was only 3.5 years old. And that's a great study group for near-death experiences because in this very young childhood age, they're practically culturally a blank slate. They almost certainly have no preconceived or rigidly formed ideas about death, cultural beliefs about death, religious beliefs about death. I mean, they're practically a blank slate. They don't really know about that. And certainly, almost certainly have never heard of near-death experiences or what to expect. But of these 26 very young children, age 5 and younger, I studied, I looked at that same 33 elements that we talked about, what occurs during the near-death experience. And to my amazement, the content, the elements, what occurs during the near-death experience, statistically the same, identical between the group of children, very young children, age 5 and younger, and older children and adults. So absolutely amazing that even in this very young age, they're still having very typical near-death experiences. There was a Dr. Sutherland who reviewed all the scholarly literature published about children having near-death experiences and found exactly what I had discovered. Dr. Sutherland states, open quote, age does not seem to affect in any way the content of the NDEs, or unquote, so thereabouts. So again, amazing even among children. I've talked several times that the NDERF has portions of the website, examples of near-death experiences, and critically the survey in over 30 different languages. So we've been able to do by far the largest cross-cultural study of near-death experience that's ever been possible, with people answering all around the world in their own language the same questions. So again, once again, from near-death experience, around the world, we're getting about a third of our near-death experiences lately are shared in non-English. So huge study. The near-death experience content worldwide is strikingly similar. Language gets in the way. I mean, how do you define unearthly or some of these concepts that you have language that's sort of unique to English? Language gets in the way a little bit, but the bottom line is the elements, the characteristics, what happens in a near-death experience, absolutely amazingly the same. Now, the strictest way to study that is what's called is near-death experiences from non-Western countries. Very different cultural and religious belief system. In my most recent research I did, we looked at over 60 non-Western near-death experiences for people that had NDEs in non-Western countries and yet knew English well enough that they could complete the English version of the survey. So that's comparing apples with apples. People in non-Western countries and Western countries, both understanding English well enough to complete the survey. And bottom line, the core content, what occurs during the near-death experience, is strikingly similar once again, even though the worlds, cultures, and religions apart. The implications are amazing. It seems no matter where on earth you are, near-death experience content will be the same. It doesn't seem to make any difference whether you're, say, a Muslim in Egypt, or a Hindu in India, or a Christian in the United States, wherever on the planet you are, if you have that near-death experience, content remarkably similar. Very strong supportive evidence that all of us, every one of us, are literally spiritual beings wherever we are on earth, having a human experience. Certainly another important line of evidence for the reality of near-death experience is how consistently lives are changed after a near-death experience. Now, from all you've heard about these NDEs already, you can imagine the impact of personally experiencing an NDE. And indeed, people that have NDEs are typically greatly changed. Now, the changes may take years. Changes, even positive changes, often take a long time. But especially years after the near-death experience, both prospective and retrospective studies very consistently find an increased belief in an afterlife. Well, that shouldn't be a surprise, should it? From the near-death experiencer's perspective, they know what lies beyond death's veil because they personally experienced it, and they know there's an afterlife for them and everybody else. And of course, a corollary for that is they have a reduced fear of death. Again, same rationale. Beyond death's door, they know there's an afterlife and nothing to be feared. Near-death experiencers grow to value loving relationships and may leave unloving interpersonal relationships or they're forced to be unloving in the job that they have and seek out loving relationships and interactions in their relations and jobs. They're significantly less materialistic and certainly have an increased belief in God. These are some of the strongest after effects you see with near-death experience. There's actually many more. Now, here's a really interesting one from the survey of 834 near-death experiencers. Talk about an increase in compassion as an after effect after the near-death experiences. We'll check this one out. Here's from the survey looking where we asked them directly, what's your level of compassion toward others? Well, before their experience, before their NDE, only about a fourth, 25%, were greatly compassionate toward others. But look down lower at the current time when they shared their experience, which in our survey is an average of about 15 years later. Wow. And over tripling, 77.6% of them are now greatly compassionate toward others. That is amazing. And I can submit, I can't think of any other single life event that results in that much of a change of individuals' values and belief and increase in level of compassion other than a near-death experience. And you see that again in another survey of our 834 near-death experiencers. Well, what about their belief in the meaning of life and significance of life? So again, survey question, what is their belief about the meaning and significance of our earthly lives? Well, before their near-death experience, only about 27% thought their earthly lives were meaningful and significant. But wow, look down at the bottom of that slide. At the current time, 78% after their near-death experience believe their earthly life is significant and meaningful. And again, an amazing change in values and beliefs following a near-death associated with a near-death experience. It shows how powerfully transformative it is. Well, as you might imagine, reduction of fear of death in near-death experiences. So again, from the same 834 near-death experiencers, look at that. Before their NDE, nearly a third, 32.5% greatly feared death. Down below, at the current time, down to 2.8% greatly fearing death. Again, a dramatic reduction in their fear of death following their near-death experience, almost certainly largely driven by their awareness that death is nothing to be feared based on their own personal experience. Okay, dang, this is a busy slide. So this was a group of 596 near-death experiencers that we looked at. I think the best way to understand this slide is we talked about the NDE scale, which is a research measurement of the depth of an NDE. If you have the let's see here. Oh, yeah. So the key thing is, this is asking about the existence of an afterlife. And at the bottom left part of this, the NDE scale ranges from 7 to 32. So at the bottom left of the slide, you'll see those that have the deepest NDEs with an NDE scale score of 25 to 32. Look at that, 48 out of 48, 100% say an afterlife definitely exists. So that belief in an afterlife is almost uniformly observed in people with the most detailed near-death experiences. Again, not a surprise, because those group of near-death experiencers have had the deepest look at NDEs. Well, here's a line of evidence number 10. Heck, while the world wonders if near-death experiences are real, here's a common sense approach to that. Ask 834 people who had a near-death experience and ask them what they think about the reality of their experience. Wow, look at that. How do you currently view the reality of their experience? 93.8 said their experience was definitely real, and only about another 5% probably real, and less than 2% believing their experience was probably not real or definitely not real. These are people that had the near-death experience, and I think it's very important to realize that people who have near-death experiences almost uniformly accept their experience was real. And in fact, in response to skeptics, out of respect for people's ability to generally understand reality, if skeptics want to represent that near-death experiences are not real, they, the skeptics, have the burden of proof to present strong evidence that NDEs are not real, and skeptics haven't even come close to that. They have no explanation for an experience that NDEers themselves almost uniformly know from their personal experience is definitely real. Holy cow, it's intermission time. So folks, here's 10 minutes to take a break. I'll be delighted to take some questions, and then we'll come jumping back in and continue this discussion.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and if you have any questions for Dr. Long right now, you can unmute yourself. One other thing too is, Marvin, send me that email now. I can send you that form, Marvin. Anybody else have any questions? You can unmute yourself.
I have a question. I'm wondering, I'm not necessarily a skeptic, but I'm always looking for, I'm the alternative explanation person. You know, with the lack of oxygen to the brain, hypoxia has been shown to elevate levels of dopamine and norepinephrine. Would that not contribute to the euphoric and hallucinogenic qualities of near-death experiences?
Yeah, and hypoxia, which is low blood oxygen levels, are typically observed, of course, when they go unconscious or clinically dead due to physical compromise. That's a lot less of a skeptic argument than it's been in the past. One reason that drives that is doctors like me, we see hypoxic patients. We see patients that have low oxygen levels, and we see clinically what happens to their level of consciousness as their oxygen level falls and falls and falls. So while there may be some increase in neurotransmission, transmitter chemistry in the brain, clinically what you observe is the lower the blood oxygen level, the more confused hypoxic patients get. They're less clear sensorium. They have less clear consciousness and alertness with less and less oxygen until they finally go unconscious. So clinically, hypoxia doesn't seem to be a good explanation. In fact, the biggest prospective study ever done by a Dr. von Lommel, was cardiac arrest, heart stopped patients. And they actually measured blood oxygen levels and found no correlation between the level of measured blood oxygen during the code and resuscitation and their probability of having a near-death experience. So that doesn't seem to be the explanation.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
Hey, this is Dr. Akula. Dr. Long, I have a quick question. Do you have any of your respondents from India? Especially, I'm very curious that, you know, when I was a kid, there is this yogi, and I'm sure that you're very familiar with a lot of this yogi that have a training in the yoga and meditation, that he actually was, you know, purposefully buried, and he lasted for several days, and he came out, I think, you know, perhaps like a week or something. And I think, you know, my understanding was in the Vedantic philosophy, I don't know if you're familiar, there is a dream, wakefulness, and deep sleep. And then there's the fourth state called Turium. And it's basically is trying to go deep down to your spirit, where you're able to control all the bodily things that are happening in the, you know, the dream, wakefulness, and the deep sleep. And you can actually keep that spiritual awakening, which extreme form of it is what is called as the samadhi. We almost like a dead while you're living, while science is still there or barely there. And I'm curious that if you're able to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing that. That's fascinating. Yes, we have a lot of near-death experiences from India. And typically they're that's a non-Western country, of course, and they do have very typical near-death experiences. You share some very interesting spiritual comments and some observations. Near-death experiences are themselves part of the spectrum of human spiritual experiences. And I'd be the first to say what we don't know about near-death experiences outweighs what we do know. And that's true of spirituality, human spirituality in general. We're all collectively worldwide on a journey of discovery. So what you've just shared there, I think, is fascinating. It's important to study the spiritual searchings and understandings all around the world, so all of us collectively can learn more. I'd love to hear more about that yogi that was buried for a couple of days. Obviously that's beyond medically inexplicable. I mean, assuming he was buried without any means of breathing, but again, it's a very remarkable account. And thanks for sharing it.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, Dr. Long, do you want to take a break for yourself, or you want to continue?
Well, we told everyone 10 minutes, so everybody may be off to who knows where, powder rooms or whatever. So I'll be back in just a few minutes, and we'll resume with the 10-minute interval we promised everybody. I'll be right back.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Hey, John, I'm trying to get you that email on my phone. I'm still working on it.
Yeah, it's CEU@canonhospice.org. If you send me an email, I'll forward you that form.
Okay, great. I'm working on it now. Thank you.
Is there anybody else that has any questions for Dr. Long on our break here?
Kind of surprising, John. There's usually a lot of questions.
Yeah, I know. I was sitting here thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah. Don't forget to unmute if you ask a question.
Dr. Long, and I hate to keep asking because I don't want to be the only guy that's asking questions, but I have a very interesting question regarding the consciousness, conscious studies. And this is about the witness conscious. Have you heard about that? And I can ask the same question at the end of the thing if somebody else has, because I don't want to take away time from the others who want to ask some questions.
Yeah, you called it witness consciousness?
Yes, because witness consciousness. Actually, there's an experience of Ramana Maharshi. I don't know if some of you guys may know. This is a sort of a saintly person in the South India, where he actually had a tumor on his right arm, big enough to be operated. And they said, hey, we got to operate on you. And then he said, good, go ahead and cut it up, but you don't have to give me anesthesia. And everybody was freaked out. What is this guy doing? And they already had a backup for the anesthesiologist, but they respected his wishes. Evidently, he was just watching it, and then he got a tumor operated without anesthesia. And I've heard about some other experiences like that. It's what is called as the witness conscious, where you actually go into these 4 stages that I told you about. In the Vedantic philosophy. There is a wakefulness, a dream state, deep sleep, and Turium, which is the fourth state where you go deep into that spiritual consciousness. And I'm glad that you said we're all spiritual beings with a human body.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what he has done, where he basically went all himself into like pretty much like 100% on the spiritual depth and was watching his own operating procedure.
Yeah.
And this
Well,
is
that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I have heard of that happening in my sort of fund of knowledge as a physician. It never fails to amaze me the amazing potential of human consciousness to do things that you would otherwise think are impossible. So yeah, wow, thanks for sharing.
Hey, Doc, quick question. It seemed from the research that most experiences stated it was a pleasurable experience, I guess. Have any ever said it was frightening?
Yeah, there's several different ways to conceptualize frightening experiences. They can be subjectively frightening, and an example of that is there was a near-death experiencer. They coded, ambulance picked him up and was rushing him to the hospital. He had that out-of-body experience. Consciousness was actually above the top of the ambulance. And while he was having his near-death experience above the ambulance rushing along, angels appeared. Now, just about everybody here would say, ooh, that's nice, how wonderful. But the angels frightened him and he was batting at it, and that was subjectively frightening. So you can be, as people everywhere, you can be frightened by things that, most people wouldn't be. But usually when people ask about frightening near-death experiences, they mean objectively frightening. And these are the hellish near-death experiences with objectively frightening imagery. These are very, very rare. In my over 4,000, I've only located a little over 20 that I thought were solid enough that I could be sure they weren't such as a confounding experience like intensive care unit delirium. In fact, I co-authored a recent study published in the Proceedings of the New York Academy of Sciences, where we NDE researchers were collectively wondering, if they even occur at all, these objectively frightening or hellish experiences. So I think they do, and I think they're very, very rare. But I think, without going into great detail, they don't seem to be a threat to anybody about the possibility of a permanent involuntary hellish realm. And that's the opinion of me, and to the best of my knowledge, all other near-death experience researchers. Even people that have these objectively frightening hellish near-death experiences, it's common for them to come back and say, hey, this helped me to confront some issues in my life, anger, guilt, some serious resentments, and I needed, if you will, a spiritual kick in the pants to really confront that going on in my life and live my life better. The most significant majority of people, even with objectively frightening near-death experiences, ultimately, as an after effect, believe that their soul is under no permanent adverse consequences.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Long, there was a message on the chat box. Someone asked a question. What's the average length of time for a near-death experience?
Wow, great question. First of all, during a near-death experience, almost uniformly, they say time's either radically different or doesn't exist. And yet, seemingly paradoxically, they describe events occurring in what we, in our earthly lives, would represent as a sequence of events. This happened first, then this, then this, then this. So the time, if you will, earthly time equivalent of events described in a near-death experience would range anywhere from, under a minute in very brief near-death experiences to literally days in very rare, or even longer in very rare near-death experiences, where the volume of series of experiences that happen typically in these unearthly realms are such that it would be days and days. And of course, when the person recovers from their near-death experience, they're typically absolutely astonished at all the things that have happened, and yet they've been unconscious or clinically dead for minutes. And everything, all time-wise in between, of course.
Great.
Dr. Long, I've got a question for you. Every time I find a book on this topic, and I'm in used bookstores pretty much, pretty good bit, I buy it. And everything so far is in all of these books is following your outline here. So my question is, I taught in graduate school for almost 10 years, and it seems to me that all of the educated, highly experienced nurses that I know believe in near-death experiences, but I've never seen it taught anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think if nurses were more informed, they would know what to ask patients at the critical times when they come back. Is this a good idea?
That is an excellent idea, and I'm glad you brought that up, because near-death experiences and consciousness, lucid consciousness, highly organized conscious when you're unconscious or dead, so flies against conventional thinking, and especially with this consistent message of an afterlife, it's just people have been reluctant to teach that in medical schools and in nursing schools. Now, I think we're seeing more and more of that. There's some places, some medical schools, and I haven't heard about nursing schools, but hopefully more going to be teaching this, because, I mean, can you imagine a patient recovering from near-death experience? They really need somebody there, and usually it's a nurse a lot more often than a doctor, that knows a lot about near-death experiences, can help them be supportive, understand, listen objectively, and help them to understand that their experience, while it was amazing, often the most dramatic experience of their life, they're not alone. And that many, probably millions around the world of people have had these experiences, and just give it time on the journey to understanding it, which often takes years. But as far as teaching it, I think that's an extremely important point. Absolutely, near-death experiences could and should be taught. Hundreds of scholarly published scientific articles should guide that, and certainly given the importance of near-death experience in people's lives, it's just a huge shame it's not taught in every medical and nursing school.
Well, I've had a number of students ask me what I thought, and my reply was pretty much the same. Not very exciting, but I would say yes. I still say yes. I believe in an afterlife. I believe in a supreme being, and I think that I wish that we had a path to put students on of discovery. In other words, say, start here and read, or between semesters, try to understand what's going on, so that you'll know that this is not hysteria or a mental problem, it's real. And you can help your patient by saying, it's real,
Yeah.
You're not crazy, and try to understand it and gain something from the experience.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of good ideas that didn't work out, but I think this one will.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. I couldn't agree more. Glad you have a belief in an afterlife. We've been hitting that pretty hard. You mentioned a supreme being. Hold on to your hat. We're going to be addressing that topic in Into Ease coming right up, among other topics.
There's a couple people that are on the chat box that are asking some really good questions. So why don't you unmute yourself while we have this chance here, and go ahead and ask Dr. Long the questions that you're putting on chat box.
Yeah, these are great questions.
It's the chat box is, not everyone is getting this information, and it's part of the learning process is to ask the questions. So if you're in the chat box chatting back and forth, why don't you ask some of those really good questions to Dr. Long?
Yeah, I can't see the questions in the chat box, so don't be shy.
Dr. Long, what about the hellish near-death experiences? I know that has to be some people that have experienced some pretty bad stuff also. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, that's correct. That's probably the most popular question I get. And you were talking about a group out of 4,000 near-death experience I've studied, a little over 20 that seem to either be aware of a hellish realm, or about half of that low 20s population either experienced it personally or were aware of it, often in some different part of the just real briefly then, with regard to hellish near-death experiences, when they are observed in near-death experiences as something separate, they're invariably, the hellish realm seems segregated. There's not other beings entered or leaving it, typically, commonly anyway. So when people say hell cannot possibly exist in heaven, I believe it, because that seems to be a very segregated, separate realm from this heavenly afterlife that near-death experiencers so commonly describe. As best I can tell from thinking about these experiences, people that end up in these hellish realms were people that actually chose to go there. And I know that's hard to believe, but understand that these are incredibly malevolent, evil beings that remained incredibly malevolent and evil, even in an unearthly heavenly realm. And in an unearthly heavenly realm, a part of existence there seems to be that you're known for who you are and everything you are. So for these people that are overwhelmingly evil in these unearthly heavenly realms, they're known immediately. So literally their heaven is to be with other malevolent evil beings that are like themselves, share the same values, and that seems to be how they get themselves in hell. I believe in near-death experiences, an overwhelmingly common and consistently observed theme is free will. That seems to be a dominant principle of the universe. And so I believe these hellish beings, even in hell, that chose to get themselves there, could choose to leave that if they so chose to do that and return to the others, the overwhelming majority in heaven. I know that may be a minority opinion for some conventional beliefs, but from NDE evidence, that seems to fit the picture best with every other type of information in NDE.
So what about people that attempt suicide? Is their experience different?
Yeah, that's been very well studied. Groups of suicide attempters and then have near-death experiences. During the near-death experience of suicide attempters, there's remarkably little judgment, and yet in their near-death experience, they typically learn vividly that their suicide is a mistake, that it was a wrong decision, that as difficult as life is, it needs to be lived throughout the completion of life. In fact, if a person had a suicide attempt and then had a near-death experience, they almost never attempt suicide again if they had a near-death experience, because they believe how important life is. Wow. For people that have a suicide attempt and don't have a near-death experience, they're far more likely to attempt suicide again and again, because they don't have that first-person belief from a near-death experience about how important and vital earthly life is, no matter how difficult.
Okay. So
yes.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I have a two-part question.
Mm-hmm.
Is a near-death experience the same as people who have outer body flights?
Yeah, I'll jump on that one first. We have another research project devoted to out-of-body experiences. We call them spontaneous out-of-body experiences. And those can definitely occur when you do not have a life-threatening event. So they're a very similar group of experiences and often describe the same things that happen. They just don't have a concomitant life-threatening event. So I'm sorry, you had a two-part question. What was your second part?
Yes, okay, and that was, yes. My second question is, do you have any information on deja vu moments?
Actually, I have sort of a friend who's a leading expert, Dr. Nepi, on deja vu, and wrote the definitive articles. Deja vu is real. That means you sort of are living your life and you have a very strong sense or awareness that you knew this before, you experienced this before. I even have a colleague I work with who just shared a deja vu experience a few days ago. So again, I think it's part of that spectrum of spiritual experiences that includes near-death experiences and sort of that expression of consciousness outside of normal earthly consciousness. So yeah, I think that's concept of deja vu fascinating, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Yes, I have had them, and my
Mhm.
children have had them, and I've met several people in my immediate circle that has had them. I wonder if, I don't know if we attract each other or whatever, but I
Yeah.
definitely know it's real because I have experienced it myself.
Yeah, they're real, and thanks for sharing that. You can reassure, tell everyone you know about your meeting tonight and what you heard.
Thank you.
Oh, Dr. Long, that makes me think of something. Once my father told me that his children, principally me, would inherit deja vu or inherit some sort of psychic talent.
Mhm.
And I always dismissed this. I thought my dad had too much trauma in World War II. But the older I get, the more I believe that.
Mhm.
What would you call that
Yeah.
talent for deja vu?
Yeah.
Or
You're right. That's a good question. I mean, there's no doubt that, as we just heard from the prior person, deja vu can, and psychic abilities in general can seemingly run in families. There's seems to be a predisposition. I don't know if it's genetic. I don't know if it's an environment that is simply more open to these type of non-ordinary experiences. If there's some type of or other factor, some predisposed type of consciousness, or a combination of all that. There's no question that it seems to run in families, and that's a real thing, and it's quite interesting. And you can have some families with some a whole string of people where in the extended family have some remarkable psychic or non-ordinary abilities. So that's certainly, we've seen that a number of times.
yeah,
Mhm.
Okay, well, Dr. Long, we're going to go ahead and start the presentation again.
Yeah, we'll do that. I'll try to blast through this. We're going to try to keep it at 2 hours and leave a little bit of time at the end here. So hold on to your hats. We'll try to blast through the rest of this here.
Okay,
We
let
were
me-
up to.
Let me go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody again.
Okay. Okay.
And you're going to have to unmute yourself. Hold on a second.
Mhm. Okay. So pushing on of our 12 lines of
Hold on
evidence.
1 second. Okay.
Yeah, all right, we're all good. So
Yep.
Here's the 11th line of evidence, or the reality of near-death experience and its consistent message of an afterlife. They're called shared near-death experiences. Now, 2 or more people may have a simultaneous life-threatening event at the same time, and they may share a near-death experience. I mean, they'd be aware of each other and communicate. I found 15, they're rare. I only found 15 shared near-death experiences. What I can conclude from that relatively small series, they do occur, and they're typical near-death experiences. They're just sharing an experience with someone else who's having an NDE. That's kind of a funky concept. So let's hear it straight from William M. In his own words, I was in the car taking my girlfriend to her parents' home in Welland, this is Canada. I fell asleep while driving. I then realized that we were out of our bodies and flying quickly upwards, holding hands. We flew straight up for about a minute. We then saw a park or country-like landscape. Suddenly, we encountered 4 creatures. 2 flanked each of us, and they began to separate us gently. They overwhelmed us with a feeling of the highest love and compassion beyond anything we could experience on earth. We were feeling a divine love. Therefore, we did not resist their effort. I felt sort of like a baby in a mother's arms, though it's hard to describe accurately. 2 of the creatures moved her upward toward the distant landscape, and 2 moved me back downward. I felt so much love, peace, and comfort. I wanted to protest and say, no, please let me stay here. But I heard inwardly or psychically that I couldn't stay. Next, I saw my car in flames from about a quarter mile up above. I felt a falling sensation and awakened in the car. The front was on fire. I moved her from leaning on me as she was when I fell asleep, knowing that her body was only an empty shell. I had left her above with the beings, and indeed, her girlfriend, her fiance actually, was dead. They shared a near-death experience, and that was the experience the two of them had together. The last experience he was able to have with her girlfriend as they died in a bad car wreck, which he survived. That's a shared near-death experience. And again, a very dramatic line of evidence that what's described in near-death experiences may well be the initial experience of those that go on to permanent irreversible death, such as the girlfriend in this account. But line number 12 certainly gets very interesting. Well, in all that I've shared here today, to the question, is there a afterlife? I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes, based on a mountain of evidence that there really is an afterlife, that near-death experiences are, in a word, real. Okay, but if there's an afterlife, well, then what can we learn about it? If we know there's an afterlife and we accept that based on evidence, what does that tell us? What does that mean about an afterlife? Well, here's some descriptions of the afterlife from near-death experiences. It's somewhat difficult to conceptualize. There's some variability in what people describe. It's not a separate, the afterlife in near-death experience is not a separate three-dimensional realm like Earth. It's different in many different ways. Communication with other beings in a near-death experience is essentially always described as telepathic. In other words, they're instantly sharing thoughts, contents of the thoughts and emotions in a way that would be far beyond anything on Earth. As noted several times, time is either radically different or non-existent in NDEs. Movement is typically non-physical. They're not moving like we do physically. In these unearthly heavenly realms, there can be landscapes or beings. As I mentioned, colors in these unearthly realms, beautiful beyond anything on Earth, literally colors that don't have earthly descriptive terms. They're that different and that beautiful. Again, same thing with music, beyond anything possible on Earth in terms of its beauty. They have typically an overwhelming sense of peace and love. Other beings are present, and they may be aware that there's a, if you will, a universal knowledge. They may become aware of knowledge vastly beyond what they knew on Earth. But when they return to their earthly body, well, as one near-death experiencer said, it's like putting an ocean of knowledge in the teacup of your brain, and you simply can't hold it all. So, and yet people are aware there is indeed that far greater knowledge than we know on Earth. Oh, let's get back to that interesting concept of time and near-death experiences. There might, I emphasize might, be a convergence of what we know of physics on Earth and NDE observations. For those of you that are math-oriented, you'll like this. For probably the great majority, I apologize, but Einstein has his famous equation, E, or energy, equals m, or mass, if you will, weight, if you will, times c, which is the speed of the light squared, the famous Einstein equation. Now, c, the speed of light, has the units of distance divided by time, because it's a speed. So if you solve that E equals mc squared equation, putting in that d divided by t for speed of light, and go ahead and solve it without going through all the math down here, it's very straightforward. You solve for basically time. And if you solve for time in Einstein's equation down here, that's what t is, then t is equal to distance divided by the square root of energy divided by mass. So what this means is, if indeed this is correct and applies to the afterlife, in any realm of existence, as E, or energy, becomes infinite, as appears to be going on in near-death experiences in heavenly realms, or as m, or mass, becomes zero, which is certainly observed in unearthly heavenly realms. But in either of these circumstances, then time approaches zero, as is observed in near-death experiences. So I'll just blow through that one quickly, just to say that there possibly is an interesting corroboration of Einstein's equation and what's actually observed in near-death experiences. Now, that's just dang fascinating. I studied 866 sequentially shared near-death experiences. The top three, well, among the top, actually it was the top descriptive words used, and these are like how often they were used in these near-death experiences, was light, love, and God. How interesting is that? Okay, for near-death experiencers themselves, that seems to be the most significant common thing they encounter. Let's look at that further. So in the afterlife concepts, okay, straight from near-death experiencers themselves, love, and we'll get into a concept of unity, and God as at least two of the top descriptors. Let's look first at love. among the most common used words in near-death experiences in describing the actual event of the experience are light and love. So again, very, very common in near-death experiences. So I was intrigued about this concept of love and near-death experience. And in the most recent version of the survey, I went right after it, asking near-death experiencers, during your experience, did you encounter any specific information or awareness regarding love? Wow, look at that. 57% said yes. We then had a text box response following this question. If they answered yes or uncertain, we asked them to respond in the text box what they meant, what information or awareness about love during their NDEs they were encountering. So here's what they had to say, direct quotes from near-death experiences about that love. I knew that love was the greatest force around us and that we are all love, and love is the only thing that is real. Love was everywhere. It permeated the afterlife. It was incredible. I was loved unconditionally despite my faults and fears. And the entire experience was one of unfathomable love. You can literally find hundreds of these descriptions. We literally copied and pasted all narrative responses on that link there for anybody who's interested. So those are the actual unedited descriptions of love, which if anybody reads even any series of those, you'll realize for yourself the overwhelming, amazing characteristics of love and near-death experience in the afterlife and how much of a force it is. Another fascinating thing that I see over and over in near-death experiences is a concept of connection or unity or oneness. And that's not something we typically believe. It's not a typical Western cultural belief, but because it was so common in near-death experiences, again, I went right after it and asked a survey question during your experience. Did you encounter any specific information or awareness that a mystical universal connection or unity, oneness? And the question said either does or does not exist. I had to throw in that or does not exist to avoid making this a leading question. And people, nearly half said yes, but importantly, once again, we had a text box narrative following the question. And in reviewing the narrative responses, I can assure you, basically 100% of those people that said yes, that nearly half of the people were answering yes in the sense that yes, they did encounter specific information or awareness that the mystical unity oneness does exist. So be aware of that. In fact, only a minority of people, 42%, said specifically no in response to that question. So wow, that's not something you learn every day in America. What did it mean? So here's from near-death experiencers that helps explain what they encountered in their NDE. I was aware of a oneness, a connection with God and all other souls, but also an individuality. We are each pieces of a greater whole, as I understand it. And getting back to where we can all be together again is the ultimate going home. And they're referring to these heavenly realms. I just felt a universal connection or unity, but it didn't really seem mystical at the time. It just felt like this is how it is. And I'm going to say yes, because I felt a larger than universal oneness. I felt connected to everything and everyone on earth and across the universe. I felt as if anything I said or did had greater repercussions than I could ever realize. And the oneness on the other side is amazing. You become one with all of life. All is connected. All is one, and all is love. These are very brief descriptions from near-death experiencers. Once again, hundreds of these types of discussions about this mystical unity, oneness, connection can be seen in that URL down there. In fact, generally, when near-death experiencers talk about this unity, they're much more likely to use the stronger word unity than the weaker word connection, which you'll see is very noticeable as you study this. Well, let's talk about God, a supreme being. Again, I was intrigued at how often God kept appearing in near-death experiences. So once again, I went right after it and asked in our most recent version of the survey, during your experience, did you encounter any specific information or awareness that God or a supreme being does, again, asked in a binary form, or does not exist? And again, when narrative responses were reviewed to this question, that 48% that answered yes, almost uniformly were saying yes, they were aware that God or supreme being, yes, does exist. So that's important. Amazing that nearly half of people having near-death experiences seem to have this awareness. And that is a huge surprise to the NDE research community. But let's talk about God encounters in a near-death experience. Asking Ann in her own words, then I became aware that I was no longer alone. God was there. I felt God as an all-encompassing presence, complete, total, and unconditional love in its highest form. I was surrounded by the unconditional love of God, and it was so much greater than human love. I was given the sure knowledge that God is real and loves me unconditionally. Wow. But descriptions of God in near-death experience, just some examples. And these are actually typical remarks about God in near-death experience. When near-death experiencers say, God is everything, energy, the fabric of everything. And you know it is a supreme being by the all-encompassing love and warmth within and outside of you, all around you and through you, in every part, in every moment. And I did not believe in God before my experience. The presence of God, the forms in which God presented itself to me were undeniable. I wasn't just given information, I experienced the information, so I would absolutely know it to be true. So here's a Sandy's discussion encounter with God. In August of 1985, when I was only 5 years old, I was on a boat trip on a local lake. I was bitten by a mosquito and developed encephalitis, which is an inflammation of the brain and very serious. I died and drifted into a safe black void of comfort and ease, no pain and no fear. This was a place where I felt right at home. Off in the distance, I saw a very small light. It was drawing me to it. I felt myself rushing towards this light with a great amount of speed. I was not frightened. When I came into the light, it represented peace and joy, but most of all, a deep, unconditional love. The light was a sparkling, glowing cloud. From inside, I heard a voice in my head, and I knew it was God. Since my parents never discussed God or took me to church, I really don't know how I knew, but I did. Furthermore, I felt like this was my real home, this place where I was with this beautiful light, which was God. I felt surrounded by the light and was one with it. The feeling was like being scooped up and held by my daddy when a barking dog was biting me just a few months earlier, only more so. Sandy, age 5, encountering God. Lonnie, in that same moment, he, God, showed, it should be me, the golden threads interwoven that made me, but that I did not exist alone. My golden energy threads extended throughout the universe, and they were not mine at all. We, humanity, are all woven together, and we are part of God's tapestry of sorts. There really are no words that can adequately describe this. In between the golden threads, however, he leaves each of us empty spaces. The way he showed me is that we can fill up these empty spaces between the weaves of threads with light or with darkness during our lives. We are made of God, but we are given free will. He has only to glance at us to know how we spent that free will. There is no way to hide any of it. So yes, these are very dramatic descriptions of God, but see for yourself. Hundreds of descriptions of God's, all narrative responses to that God survey question are posted at that URL. And you can see for yourself, literally in hundreds of descriptions of near-death experiences, understanding God in that very unique way during their near-death experience. And of course, if there's a God and love is so important in the universe, well, no doubt God is overwhelmingly loving. That seems to be the number one by far descriptor of God in near-death experiences. No human, again, talking about God and near-death experiences, no human can ever love with the love I felt in that light. It is all-consuming, all-forgiving. Nothing matches it. It is like the day you looked into the eyes of your child for the first time, magnified 1,000,000 times, indescribable. And it wasn't just, I felt unbelievable love. I was unbelievable love. God is love, and that God was within me and all of us. I know that love is all there is, and that God loves all of his children deeply and equally. There are no stepchildren in the family of God. We are all divine. And God loves us all infinitely. And again, there's that URL, literally hundreds of descriptions that go on and on about God in NDE. And of course, when we talked about unity and we talk about God, well, not surprisingly, there's a sense of unity with God. I was aware of a oneness, a connection with God and all other souls, but also individuality. And I did not see God with eyes, but God was everything and everywhere. There was no separation felt in the experience. I saw the radiant sea of light we call God, and I swam in it as one with God. There was no religious God. There seemed to be a supreme being, though I feel that we are all part of that being. And we are all one. One is God. The separation of one to two is life. There was a definite sense that I was part of everything and that I am God also. And this collective consciousness that I became a part of is God, or that is the feeling I got. It is a state of pure energy and pure love. And by the way, I keep using the term God, but many, many near-death experiencers say God is simply an earthly word. When they encountered that God, that supreme being in their near-death experience, that which they encountered is far beyond earthly words and descriptions. And I certainly want to emphasize that important point. So a few final thoughts from near-death experiencer. I came to understand that life is an opportunity for us to express and experience love. Oddly enough, that includes those times when life turns on us. All that happens to us happens for a reason, and that reason is learning. And another near-death experiencer said, life's meaning or purpose is love, clear and simple love. And here's what I put in my book. The evidence from near-death experience is that God loves us all. Again and again, one reads in NDE accounts how God loves us, regardless of who we are, what we look like, how young or old we are, or what our shortcomings may be. We are loved by God for exactly who we are and what we are. And wow, I find that amazingly inspirational. But that's really my beliefs about God obviously personally changed radically through my near-death experience research, converging with my beliefs with what I saw as overwhelming evidence in NDEs. So let's talk a little bit of conclusions here. Converging lines of evidence, many lines of evidence, all 12 of them actually, are all converging on the fact that near-death experience are absolutely real, along with the consistent message of an afterlife in NDEs. Now, this is a strength of multiple lines of evidence about the reality of NDE and an afterlife. Alternative or skeptical explanations of NDE have absolutely failed. There is no physiological, cultural, psychological explanation that comes close to explaining all that evidence. So in that evidence that we have of an afterlife in NDEs, that is a powerful message of hope and inspiration. So I think the key message that certainly I feel from my NDE research that I love sharing with the world is absolutely death is not the end, but a beginning. And there is a wonderful afterlife for all of us, and that all the messages from near-death experience are among the most powerful and positive messages conceivable for all of humanity. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'm gonna do
And
that.
so we do have some time for questions. Great.
Yeah, so hold on a second. Okay, everybody